Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Klinenberg. I am the director of the IPK, also a professor of sociology. Can you just give me a raised hand if it's your, I know you don't know what I'm gonna ask, you can hear me, but so A+ on that. I'm just actually wondering, is anyone here at IPK for the first time tonight? Oh, fantastic, that's great. It's a new year, so come more often. Generally speaking, when the new academic year begins, there's this sense of like hope and possibility, and you think about all the exciting things that could happen in this new academic year. I can't decide whether I want to be up or down. I'm going to go up. I don't want to block Chris. This year, we all walk into the new academic year with a little bit of trepidation. Like on the one hand, we feel that kind of sense of excitement and buzz and possibility. On the other hand, it's a momentous time. We don't have any idea what we're barreling towards, but we feel like we're barreling towards something. There are all kinds of issues that we've been arguing about and rallying around and organizing around on campuses and elsewhere. And we enter this new academic year in the throes of all of that. And so here at the IPK, we do a lot of public events. We have working groups that take on projects like the future of democracy and climate change and the future of work and AI and the rise of the extreme right. And this year, these first few months, we're going to try to spend as much time talking about democracy and the challenges for democracy as we possibly can. So there's a lot of programming here. So if it is your first time at the Institute and you wound up here because you're a big Astra Taylor fan or a big Chris Hayes fan, please go back to the website and check out the other programming and come back. We'd love to have you. The Institute is really about kind of creating dialogues between people in the university who don't always talk to each other, and also between people in the university and all the people out there in our neighborhood and different communities we're embedded in. So, so thanks for being here. The occasion for tonight's conversation is we want to talk about solidarity, what this concept is all about, where it comes from, why so many people invest so much hope in it, why what it looks like in theory on the page is different from what it feels like in practice when we try to do it, and maybe how it can be reinvigorated, redefined, and brought to life for whatever future awaits us. And for those of you who know me, I'm a sociologist who has thought a lot about solidarity over the course of my career, but there's different meanings of the concept, and one of them has been about ideas of belonging and connection and how we make society or a group come into being. Another meaning of solidarity, and another vector of this term, is about organizing and transformation and building solidarity to build strength for a conflict, to win things. And tonight, those two different ideas are going to be very much on the table. I've thought about this concept and used it in my work for decades, but I can't tell you how much I learned from reading this new book by Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor, called Solidarity: The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea. So Astra was actually here last year for a conversation about a different book, but when I learned about this book, I knew we had to have Astra back. And one quick note at the end of this conversation, we're going to do a book signing in the back, and unfortunately we bungled the thing, so we have Astra's previous book, but not the Solidarity book back there. And she's very gracious, and she's going to sign her previous book, which previous is like it came out a few months ago. But we're going to find a way to make sure that you can all get the Solidarity book too. We'll make that easier for you. Astra's going to talk a little bit to get us going. I'm going to follow up with a few words, and then some of you might recognize this man behind me, Chris Hayes. I can't think of a better person to moderate, and not really moderate, but to push the conversation. Intensify. Is that a thing you get to do? If you're not a moderator, but an intensifier. So Chris will come and intensify the conversation, and then we're going to open up for all of us. So Without saying much more, can you, I didn't say much by way of introduction, except for that Astra wrote this terrific book, and you all know Chris Hayes from MSNBC, and his forthcoming book, tell me this, The Siren's Call about attention, which is coming out at the end of January, and we're going to do everything we can to get Chris back here. Anyway, that's enough from me. Help me welcome Astra Taylor.
We have an abundance of mics. Thank you, Eric, for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here with my friend Chris. Hello, everyone. So I was invited to kick things off to speak for 10 or 15 minutes to kind of set the stage for tonight's discussion. And so I guess I'll begin with a simple question. Why solidarity? Eric got into it a little bit. It's a word we hear a lot, especially if you travel in certain activist circles, right? We hear solidarity on the picket line, we hear it at protests. Some of us even sign our emails with the phrase "in solidarity," but it's something that can seem kind of self-evident. It's not necessarily a term that we really dig into or think more about. I'm, sharing thoughts that are from my co-authored book, Solidarity. So I'm channeling my co-author, Leah, who started thinking about this topic actually when she was an undergrad, and she was involved in some living wage campaigns, and she ended up writing her dissertation on solidarity, and she says that she was asking her professors, where can I learn more? And so she went to the academic library, and she's like, goes to S and looks around to see what she can find. And there wasn't much on the shelves, right? There were some books about the Polish solidarity movement, some books about solidarity with Latin America in the 80s and the 70s, but not a lot about solidarity as a core part of the political canon, which is what it should be. If you go to those academic libraries or bookstores, you'll see a whole bunch of books on equality, on freedom and liberty, right? On democracy. I even wrote one of those books. But very little about solidarity. And we think that's a real problem. Sociologists are actually the people who get it. Sociologists get solidarity. But this lack of attention is a real problem because solidarity is something that deserves to be up there in the democratic pantheon, right? Along with those other concepts, equality, freedom, et cetera. And I know Eric agrees with me because one of the final sentiments of his great book, 2020, that we're also going to talk about tonight, is this. He writes, "No democratic society can survive without a healthy supply of social solidarity." And so I think for me, if there's one thing I want people to leave with tonight, it's this idea that solidarity is actually a precursor to democracy. It's fundamental. We actually will not ever be able to build a multiracial democratic society without really putting effort into building solidarity. And so why? Why is it central to democracy? I think it's really simple. Solidarity is a relational concept, right? It's about how we relate as people, as individuals, as groups, and democracy is people doing stuff together. So solidarity is key. It's really missing. So Eric mentioned this a bit, that there's this dual character to solidarity. It's simultaneously a bond. It's something that holds society together. Sociologists talk about it as a measure of group cohesion, but it's also a force that propels society forward, that creates power and change. And I think it actually makes intuitive sense. So putting on my organizer hat, when people feel connected, they're more likely to stand up for each other, right? So it's the force that, achieved universal suffrage, the weekend, rights for trans people, right? Equality for women, all these good things. But to say that solidarity is good and that it helped us get all this good stuff is really the easy part, right? The hard part is how we actually build it, how we imbue our social institutions and our policies with a sense of mutualism and fellow feeling. And I think that's important. I think solidarity can be institutionalized. So Leah and I lay out a framework of something we call a solidarity state. And there are very few forums to kind of learn about how to do solidarity, or there aren't enough given how big our society is and how vast the problems we're facing are. And this is perhaps particularly true in the United States, where we live in a culture that really emphasizes individualism. Another theme of Eric's book, he talks about the paradox of individualism. And also where the opponents of solidarity are very clear about what they're doing and how desperately they want to sabotage solidarity. We live in a country where a tremendous amount of money and energy has gone into sabotaging and criminalizing solidarity, undermining the institutions that advance it, particularly labor unions, and I would increasingly argue institutions of higher education, right? Structures where solidarity is cultivated. So, cultivated. What I'm saying here is that just as solidarity needs to be cultivated, so does division, right? Neither of these things are just happening spontaneously. And I think we can see the power of solidarity in the scale of these attacks on it, right? And this goes back, we trace the war on solidarity back to the colonial era, to the outright criminalization of labor unions as illegal conspiracies back in the day, to things like the Fugitive Slave Act that basically, forbid any kind of racial solidarity, to things that are happening today. For example, in Georgia, the outlawing of, or the making very difficult of creating bail funds for folks in the aftermath of Cop City, or the bounty laws in Texas, right, that essentially incentivize citizens turning on each other to take away people's reproductive freedom, or even the suppression of student protests around the genocide in Gaza. So we see the suppression of solidarity all over the place, and also just in the rhetoric, right, the anti-wokeness, the fear-mongering about DEI and CRT. This is all about attacking solidarity. So the right knows that solidarity is scary to them, and that makes the fact that liberals and the left don't pay enough attention to it all the more kind of tragic, right? And I think we have to meet the moment. Okay, but what kind of solidarity are we talking about? And so Leah and I took advantage of the fact that there wasn't a lot on those library shelves to put forth our own theory of solidarity. But we did follow the folks who have tread this path before. People who have written about solidarity at length tend to offer various taxonomies. And this tendency goes all the way back to Emil Durkheim, who was the first person to really write about this, who wrote about the opposition between organic and mechanical solidarity. In recent decades, for example, authors have differentiated between factual and normative solidarity. I confess I can't really remember what the distinction was. Civic, social, and political solidarity. Our event said we were talking about social solidarity tonight. And Chris wrote a great essay when you were a young writer. Not that you're old, we're the same age, so we're not old, but younger, that distinguished between mundane and sublime solidarity. And that essay was actually a real touchstone for Leah and I as we were starting this project. Leah and I settled on a different set of categories: transformative solidarity on the one hand and reactionary solidarity on the other, to clearly show that not all solidarity is good. It can be bad, it can be neutral, it can be awesome. And so distinguishing between these types is sort of a key thing, and obviously we are partisans for transformative solidarity, which we say is both personal and political. The transformation that it seeks changes the self, but also changes social structures. It reaches out to other people and envisions new futures and tries to create those. It expands the circle of inclusion, sort of bridging beyond given identities, whereas reactionary solidarity turns inwards, affirms sameness, and shrinks that circle of inclusion. So we can all think of examples of reactionary solidarity. We open actually with the example of the Southern strategy in the 60s and use, and begin with that example of reactionary solidarity. And it's not just that we think reactionary solidarity is morally abhorrent, though it is, right? The problem with it is that it abets the plutocratic project of divide and conquer. So when nationalists blame immigrants for social and economic troubles, it's loathsome, but it's also empirically wrong and purposefully so, right? It's designed to deflect blame and to stop people from looking critically at the economic interests in individuals who profit from a splintered working class. The other thing we talk about that might be useful for tonight is the fact that we see solidarity as a means and an ends. So it's both the means of building power for people, but also a way of describing the world that we want to build. We want to build a more solidaristic society, that solidarity state that I mentioned. And this was clear to the early modern theorists of solidarity, that solidarity could describe the world we're actually trying to reach. And the question of solidarity has historically come up in periods of profound tumult and change. So we are carrying on an esteemed tradition by being here tonight thinking about this. And there are, so we spent quite a bit of time talking about this sort of modern intellectual vanguard we're talking about solidarity in these two types of solidarity that Eric mentioned. So we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, right? A period of mass migration, of social dislocation, of changing economic, social, political mores, sort of, increasing democratic structures, and people were wondering, what's going to hold society together in the absence of God or king, right? This is scary. And some theorists settled on the idea of solidarity. They started thinking about solidarity as this, glue, as this bond that would hold increasingly fragmented societies together. And some of the folks thinking about this they called themselves the solidarists. Their philosophy was solidarism. They were really high on solidarity. Like, there are people writing at the turn of the century, so 1900, and they're like, solidarity's on everyone's lips in Paris. This is it. Everybody is like, what is this new idea? This is amazing. And Emile Durkheim identified with this tradition, others, but the main thinker was this guy, Léon Bourgeois. And his name is telling, because he was bourgeois. They were these upper-class French guys. They were philosophers. They were statesmen. But they were saying, solidarity is it. We have a stake in remaking our society, in creating social structures that care for people, in building a welfare state, which is a new idea at this moment, right? And they write not just in an interesting way, but a really beautiful way about solidarity as a way of paying back what they called our social debt. So this is something that's very interesting to me as I work on debt, about the fact that we are all born needing care. We're all vulnerable. So they kind of anticipate some of the care discourse, and that we actually have to create structures of solidarity to care for each other because we need care throughout our lives. They even talk about reparative justice, about the fact that we need to make amends for social wrongs. So these folks were thinking more about social cohesion. They're trying to persuade their fellow, upper class guys to create a better form of government. And then, of course, there's the other track, which is the labor movement, which is gaining huge momentum at this time and is, creating this more fighting conception of solidarity. And maybe this is just the benefit of not being academic, but I was like, why do we have to choose? Let's just have both these traditions and think about them together. So that's what the book does. So, but I want to end with this thought, which is that I don't think that I would have known that this was an interesting topic or something worth writing about, learning the history of, if I hadn't spent the last 10 years really seriously organizing. So Leah and I met at Occupy Wall Street. Leah actually organizes donors. She's an heiress. She's got a very interesting history. I organize with debtors. So I founded something called the Debt Collective, which is an experimental union of debtors. We are most known for putting student debt cancellation on the agenda. We are not it's not really that we just are obsessed with debt cancellation. It's that we see debt as a way of opening a new avenue in the fight for social, racial, economic justice, right? Because it's a short skip and a jump from going, gosh, I have student loans I can't pay to, I want free college. I have medical debts that I can't pay. I deserve universal health care. When we founded the Debt Collective 10 years ago, this year, it was hardly a given that debtors would see themselves as having anything in common with each other, right? Why would a student debtor from Harvard see themselves as having something in common with the University of Georgia graduate or a for-profit college student, let alone that a student debtor would have some solidarity with a medical debtor or a carceral debtor or somebody with payday loans? So we've cultivated that. We've created that solidarity, created an organization. And just last week, we had an action in DC. So y'all probably know there's been a lot of stuff with student debt cancellation, the Supreme Court, and yada, yada. I won't go into it. I have a lot of feels. But there is a little-known federal regulation we uncovered that enables this Department of Education to cancel a student debtor's loan based on their age. And older student debtors are the fastest growing demographic, people over 60 in this country, for reasons you can intuit. We ain't got any jobs, old age security here, right? Like, people are told, go reinvent yourself when you've lost your job. People are taking out loans for their kids. But they didn't feel welcome in our movement because student debt is seen as a young person's thing. So for the last year, we've been consciously bringing in older folks, naming them, not just opening the door, but bringing them in. So we had a big action, the first time older student debtors have ever rallied in DC last week. And brought all these older folks from across the country to say, use this federal regulation, cancel our debt, retire our debt so we can retire, stop bearing us in debt, because they will get a debt discharge when they die. They're saying, do it now. So one of the people there was Gail Gardner. She's 77. She's from Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia. She owes $550,000 in debt. And I just want to end by reading a text message that she sent us after this action. I can't begin to tell you how I am trying my best to process what happened, but it was so fantastic and so fresh and so new in my life that I can't express it all. I went to Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, and I got an award. But that was nothing like being with the Debt Collective and those who came to join in solidarity. We must do this again. And she told us that she went back to Stone Mountain and she told the young people, I'm fighting for you, right? So you don't have to grow into this debt. So that's, to me, that feeling is sublime, to use your word, and that's the power of solidarity. It's transforming a person's experience and their sense of what the world is and what the world can be.
All right, that was great. I'm going to step over here because I realize like a line of people. It's better if I'm over here. Yeah, can you see me? So I went to graduate school in sociology, and my main professor was French, and he was obsessed with this tradition of the French solidarists. And when you go to graduate school and you study sociology, you read Marx, the transformative power, conflict, radical, and you read Durkheim. And Marx is like infinitely sexier than Durkheim, right? I mean, like there's nothing worse, there's like no worse way for you to turn off everybody in your graduate school in sociology than be like, actually, I think this Durkheim guy is the one who had it. And it remains the case if you teach the introductory sociology courses, theory courses. When you get Marx, you get this radical, transformative tradition and some amazing prose, right? Like the Communist Manifesto as literature. And Durkheim, it's like, well, there's religion and sacred, but like when you read, it's what's so fun about your marriage of Durkheim and Marx here is that you remember that, without the feeling of connection, without the making of a group, right? And E.P. Thompson would do this later with the making of class, but what Durkheim tells you is the making of a polity. Right? What you learn in Durkheim is this kind of spirit of generosity that connects our individual struggles and existential struggles to others, that makes it possible to think about us as a we, right? So public education, or public housing, or public transit, or Social Security, or public health. These things make no sense without some notion of a we, and the notion has to be compelling enough that we're willing to give something of ourselves for it, and to think like we may lose some dollars from our pocket, and we may lose maybe even some level of the freedom to do all the things we want to do, but we do it because ultimately the returns to us, including the returns to our freedom, will make it worthwhile, right? Because it's actually, and I think this is kind of the brilliance of the Durkheimian position that you resurrect here so nicely. It's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. Right? It's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. Years ago, I wrote a book called Going Solo about the fact that more people are living alone than ever before, and it was like a mind-bending project for me because what I learned in the end is that the places where the most people are living alone, not isolated, not lonely, but just living alone, are not the hyper-individualistic countries like the US or the UK or Australia. The places on earth that have the highest levels of people living on their own are the Scandinavian countries, because when you have a generous welfare state, when you have public benefits, when you have a society that has your back, you become free to live your life in the way that works best for you. And that means you can be in a relationship and living with someone when the relationship works well. And it also means if the relationship doesn't work well, and you need a moment just to regather yourself, or you need many years to regather yourself, or you decide to regather yourself for a lifetime, you have the freedom to do that. It's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. And it was channeling those ideas from my education as a sociologist that in the beginning of 2020, in the early days of 2020, when I heard, as you did, that there was this new coronavirus that was making its way across the planet, that the salience of these ideas, not for some of the things that Astra talked about right away, but the salience ideas for this particular moment became clear to me. And I presume 2020 was a long time ago. And I wrote this book called 2020, which is like an invitation for all of you to go back to 2020, because I know what you've been longing for is a chance to revisit that time in your life. But I want to tell you that I think it's worthwhile. I'm even going to go over here because I hate blocking Chris Hayes. It feels wrong to me. I'm going to go here. Do you remember this phrase from 2020 in the beginning that the World Health Organization said, there's this horrible new virus that's coming, and the thing that you need to do to get through it, remember what they told us we needed to do? We needed to socially distance, right? So the way that you're going to get through this crisis is social distancing. And I remember at the moment thinking, like, okay, there's a kernel of a really good idea here, right? Like, there's a new virus. We don't know how to detect it necessarily. We don't have medication for it. We don't really know how to treat it. It's incredibly contagious, right? I understood the impulse. Like, of course, you should just distance yourself. But it struck me that this was exactly wrong, because what the message of social distancing says, when there's a threat in the world, what you need to do is, like, take yourself and maybe gather your friends and your family and lock the door to your home, distance yourself from the world, and, come out on the other side when it's all over. But the problem we know from experience in the world is that some people will be able to distance themselves. They could work remotely. They can get remote food. They food deliver. They make sure that they're not exposed. But we live in a world where there are lots of people who will be exposed. And so for those of us who are able to socially distance to do it, would mean leaving everyone else to suffer the consequences. And that seemed wrong. So it occurred to me right away at the beginning, like the World Health Organization's got the messaging wrong. What we should be saying at this moment is physical distancing, social solidarity. Right? The message for getting through 2020 had to be physical distancing, social solidarity. And you might remember here in New York, anyone in New York 2020, just raise your hand if you're in New York City in 2020. Remember this amazing ritual that we had in New York where at the end of the workday, 6, 7 o'clock, right, we'd bang our pots and pans to express gratitude for the healthcare workers, right? And this was like an act of, we see that you're doing this thing for us, and we acknowledge you, we recognize you, we thank you, and we see the way in which we're in this together. And that was a profound act of solidarity. It was a meaningful act. But the thing I kept thinking about as I saw that ritual unfold is the selectivity of our solidarity at that moment. Because at the same time that we were banging our pots and pans for the doctors and the nurses, we created this category, which we'd never really used before in public life, to designate a whole special kind of person, a class of people, actually, in the world, that didn't exist before. Do you remember this one? The world had fallen apart, right? It was such a scary moment. We were told, don't go to your office. We're closing down the school. Your restaurant is closed. There'll be no drinking in the pub. You can't play pickup basketball. Sorry, the beaches are closed too. Unless you're an essential worker. And if you're told you're an essential worker, right, like the idea of an essential worker, like what a radical and amazing, generous thing to say from the state. We the state, we society recognize that some of us, the labor some of us perform is more valuable than the labor that others perform, right? You play a special, exalted role in society, right? And we live in New York City, so we know that the essential workers are the finance guys, right? And the white shoe loft guys, right? The nets, okay? No, but actually we don't know that, right? What we know is that they're the most valued in the marketplace, but that the essential workers who are most valuable are the clerks, are the infrastructure maintenance workers, are the public transit workers, are not just the doctors and the nurses, but the people who are preparing food in the hospitals and cleaning the hospitals, right? And the agricultural workers and the workers in the meatpacking plants, right? There's this world of essential workers out there. And we had this fascinating thing that happened in 2020, and the reason I think we should think about 2020 in this conversation about solidarity is because here was a moment when we spoke a truth, right? It was this open secret that we all know, which is whose labor is valuable, which is who are the essential workers. We said it out loud, right? We said this thing out loud. And one could imagine that in society, when you say the open secret out loud, you're taking on a kind of moral commitment, right? Like all of those people we've asked to do this work, you know, we recognize you, we will compensate you, we will honor you, we will make sure you have PPE, we will make sure you get the best health care available, right? But in the United States, at that moment, to be named essential was to be deemed expendable, right? And it wasn't just you, it was everyone you came home to, right? And the reason that when we looked at those maps of New York City in 2020 and we saw those red zones, right, in parts of Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn, and not so much here, was because it was the essential workers who were living in crowded apartments, right? And so you go into the workforce without PPE because you're essential, you bring it home to your family, and you compound the crisis. So the question for me at the time was like, where was our solidarity then? And one of the things that keeps me up at night in the aftermath of 2020 is that it does feel to me like at this moment we collectively kind of walked to this moral precipice, right? We got to the edge of this moral precipice and we had this moment of recognition. We said things out loud. We made a sacred vow. You take care of me and make sure I can get my groceries. I'll take care of you, and we didn't. We didn't follow up on that thing. And in our rush to forget what we lived through in 2020, right, to take that out of our consciousness, to act as if it's over so we can move on, because no matter our politics, we don't want to think about what we did that year. Right? We've let all of those lessons go. We've let all of the moral implications of that year go. And I know it's weird to talk about morality in a social science setting, but we're talking about a kind of moral pact that makes society possible. Last thing, and then I want to get to Chris and our conversation. The story we tell about 2020 is a horrific one, and I'm interested in all the ways in which we broke down our lines of connection and solidarity, broke down where it shouldn't have. But there is a kind of shining star of that year that I think we also should heed and pay attention to, because if we're going to get out of the situation we're in now and take ourselves to some other place, it will be because we see not just the things we failed, but the ways we can succeed. And what I'm referring to is this emergent form and organization that we saw all over the city. You can jump right in the front row if you want to. There's seats in the front. We saw in places that needed them most, and it's the opposite of the hyper-individualism and the conflict part of America that we saw in the news. There's these things called, also probably know what I'm going to say, mutual aid network, right? The rise of mutual aid in 2020 was an extraordinary thing. And it's not as if mutual aid projects weren't happening before. It's just that we leaned into them, we ramped them up, we made them work in a way that allowed people and communities to survive. In the book, I write about 7 different people in New York City whose experiences represent the place where they live, but are also, in some ways, speaking to core themes of that year. And one of the favorite characters from the book for me is this woman named Nuala O'Doherty, who lives in Jackson Heights, Queens, one of the densest, most diverse neighborhoods on earth, and realized that her community was going to be in trouble because there are so many immigrant workers who are part of the cash economy who depended on their next paycheck, and the paycheck wasn't going to come, and it wasn't clear what lines of aid would be available, what kinds of assistance people would be able to get. You could just open the door, and Nuala one day decided early in the pandemic, you might want to jump in the front row because there's seats here. Maybe not, maybe you don't, but I think you do, Nikhil. It's what you get for being late. You got to sit in the front row now. So Nuala decided early in the pandemic she's going to write on a little Post-it note, "If you need help, call me." And she put her phone number on this thing, and they turned it into little mimeograph posters and put them up all over Jackson Heights, and woke up the next day and there were dozens of messages on her phone. And so then she's like, what am I going to do? I can't handle this. And she wrote another message that said, "If you can give help, call me." And within a few weeks, there were thousands of people on both ends. She turned an anonymous urban neighborhood into a kind of moral community of people giving and taking and helping with diapers and food, right, with medications, with direct service. I can watch your kids even though there's a pandemic. I will come over because you need to get to work. And transform the place where she lived, and it lasts this day. And it's an amazing thing. It wasn't just Jackson Heights. It happened all over the city. It happened all over the country. It happened in places all over the world. And I'm going to leave you with this. When the book was coming out, New York Magazine asked me if we could reproduce the profile of Nuala, because it's an amazing story of mutual aid that we need to hold on to, because we need to know we're more than just the conflict and the hyper-individualism and the narcissism and all of it. And they said, before we publish it, just can you reach out to Nuala and find out what she's doing? So I called Nuala, and I asked her about this COVID care network, which she operated out of her basement with all these people. And it was just earlier this year, 2024, and she said, "Oh, we're not doing COVID care. The basement that we used to do, it's now the Jackson Heights Immigration Center." And Nuala and the same network of people who were taking care of each other in the pandemic had just changed course. She's an attorney, and they were helping new migrants to New York City file the paperwork so that they could get into the immigration system and get Social Security cards in 6 months when no one responded at INS because they were overwhelmed. So she's turning new migrants into potential New Yorkers and workers who could be here and take care of themselves and take care of each other. And it was an amazing thing. She does it every 3 days a week. Thousands of people have gone into this clinic. And I guess what it points to for me is the fact that there is, to this day, this kind of invisible civic infrastructure in our neighborhoods, in the country. As dark and down as things get, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that there are stores of the solidarity that Astra's talking about. The Debt Collective is one prominent one, and what an amazing thing that Astra and the community you've been working with has taken this impossible burden of debt and turned it into the organizing basis for a group that comes into existence around it and gets billions of dollars of debt relief, policy changes lives. That is within all of us. And I think it's within this country. And I think it's important for us to remember that in the weeks ahead. So thank you very much.
That was great, both of you. So I thought maybe we can start with discussion, maybe Astra, to just talk about a little bit about the distinction between solidarity and on the one hand, and then community and identity on the other, because it seems to me like a huge thing that's at play in the power of the concept, as you write in the book, is its kind of plasticity, its sort of stretchability, where obviously identities are constructed as well, and communities are constructed, but we tend to think of them as more received, I think. I'm I'm this race or I'm from this neighborhood. And the power, in some ways, of what you're talking about is, as I think you've instantiated at the Debt Collective, is to stretch whatever community conceptions we have as inherited or identity conceptions we have to sort of feel something similar to the feeling of being in a neighborhood that's not necessarily received.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have all these ideas based on all the stuff Eric said, but to that point, we wrestle a lot with this in the book, trying to distinguish or give some oxygen between solidarity and identity. Identity is really important to solidarity, but solidarity cannot be reduced to it. And you're absolutely right. Almost every given identity category is constructed, and if we take that lens. But I think what's the kind of transformative solidarity we're interested in is trying to do is expand that circle of inclusion, and that can be done through creating new identities. And so that's why I think it is really useful to remind ourselves that the category of worker is something that emerged out of specific historical conditions, and that people worked to create that category, that it wasn't intuitive to folks who were cobblers and bricklayers and painters and other guild members that they had stuff in common. We also talk a lot about the rise of the disability justice movement, which is a really recent, powerful example. It was not that intuitive to people in the 50s, not that long ago, that folks with different embodiments, different impairments, different modes of being in the world had something in common, that somebody with a physical disability would have something in common with an intellectual disability, would have something in common with someone who is an amputee versus someone with a congenital condition. And that folks were inspired by the civil rights movement and said, well, hold on, let's think about things in a different way. Let's build a community of folks who then, as you say, feel this kinship at a distance, right? And can see themselves as having something in common. The risk, I guess, is that those conceptions, become reactionary, right? That these, any new category we make can become reactionary in certain circumstances. So debtor is, as I said, a category we've worked hard to build. But there could be reactionary debtor politics, and historically there have been.
Yes.
So for example, after the Civil War, plantation owners and white landowners organized and rallied for very reactionary debt relief, right? And sort of got that in lieu of land distribution.
Successfully, yes, we should know.
Successfully. So I think this is something we have to work on. The category of essential workers are really, I think, a really interesting example. And just thinking about I guess I just want to say a moment about COVID, because we actually started seriously writing this in the COVID moment. And there was this moment, you even used this quote at the end of your book, where we were all like, what's going to happen out of this? Wow, maybe we'll have a collective epiphany of our interdependence and our vulnerability, and we'll start caring for each other. And the pandemic is a portal. As Arundhati Roy said, it was a portal. It was a portal to here. And I think it was a reminder of this fact that we have to do the work of constructing solidarity. And one interesting historical tidbit is the political scientist Margaret Cohn is actually, who writes a lot about the solidarists and that movement. And a big prompt for them was actually the emergence of the field of epidemiology and this awareness of infectious disease and the fact that we are touching at a distance, that we are connected. And this kind of nascent scientific knowledge that pointed towards interdependence, not just socially, but on a sort of physical level that has only been validated over the last century. And so it was interesting to see that epiphany kind of, that condition prompt a similar epiphany, but because we didn't do whatever work needed to be done to maintain solidarity in that moment, reactionary forms of solidarity, I think, gained a lot of momentum.
Could I just add one quick thing to that, which is remarkably and disturbingly, where we are today is in some ways worse than where we were going into the 2020 pandemic, because the reaction against public health, right, against solidarity, is organized and fierce. And it's significant to track this story, because when we think about the justifications for a welfare state, right, like public health is way up there as things that we can manage collectively, but that you can't solve individually. And I've just come from meetings with 2 deans of public health schools who are tracking the organized campaign to discredit the intellectual foundations of public health, the folks who are behind the Great Barrington.
Like the germ theory of disease?
Maybe not that dude. I'm glad we didn't have a private health crisis right there. I would have felt bad about that. No, at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and in coming days, I believe at Johns Hopkins, not in the public health school, but maybe the business school, there are organized efforts of libertarian academics who are trying to organize an attack on the legal foundations of public health, based on a revisionist history of what happened in 2020. So, so the fact of a shared experience doesn't mean we have one outcome or another. And what I fear, again, after 2020 is that because we've been in such a rush to put the experience behind us, we've ceded to the revisionists the capacity to redefine this in politically very powerful ways. And it's been really startling for me. Chris, you and I talked in the beginning of the year before the presidential campaigns really ramped up, but it's been startling for me to see just how little traction this has gotten from Democrats and progressives. It's like there's a kind of a will just to stay away from it.
There totally is. I think it has to do with that. Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, I think one, I don't know if people first learned about the great flu epidemic after World War I, but when you did learn about it, the first thing you learned was like, oh, that's crazy that happened and I hadn't heard of it. That's sort of the first way you learn of it, right? Like, oh, it killed more people than World War I. I've never heard of it until now, but I've heard of World War I. That's the kind of like, that's the sort of tease for it. And then after COVID, it's like, oh, I kind of get it. Like they didn't want to talk about it or think about it or go back there, which during COVID, I was like, so weird. Now I sort of get it. So that's sort of blocking out. But I guess what I want to ask you as a follow-up, like Astra, you're talking about sort of the work that wasn't done maybe during 2020, and I think part of that's true. Although I think also there's a lot of confounding variables. There was a lot of work done. The largest protest in American history happened in 2020. Why? Why did we end up on the wrong side of it? Like there's comparative examples. Like in South Korea, they had an outbreak of MERS after SARS, and it was really bad in South Korea, and there was huge political tumult out of it. All of the things that happened in South Korea that led to their very good COVID response came out of the political tumult of that, including testing, including contact tracing, masking, all this stuff. So there's different ways that you can react. That's sort of a policy, but I think there's 2 ways to think about the U.S. reaction, right? One is the U.S. has lower levels of social solidarity to begin with. If there's like some index of 1 to 10, we're not that high, which I think is probably true to the extent that you could put a number on it or conceive of it in those terms. And number 2, to me, the big thing I think about is trust. So social trust to me seems necessary but not sufficient for social solidarity, but the kind of necessary precondition, and we've got a bunch of international metrics for social trust, and the US is really low. And that to me seems the key variable. What is your theory for why it went the way it did?
Yeah, so there's a chapter on trust in my book, and I think you're right to go right there because you can't build solidarity in a sense of we-ness if I think you're going to stab me in the back the moment I turn around. And it's true that the U.S. ranks fairly low in, comparatively on levels of trust, and also it's true that the U.S. ranks comparatively high on levels of individualism. So it had a lot going against it. That said, there are other countries on Earth that had very similar preconditions. And in the book, I make comparison with Australia, which is really striking for its extreme individualism and also for the levels of distrust going into the year. Mind you that when 2020 begins, they were just at the end of these bushfires that were completely catastrophic, and the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is a climate denier, climate change denier, and was really adamant that these things had nothing to do with climate change. He was like expressing a lot of skepticism about science and trying to sow distrust. And it's really remarkable to see the course that Australia takes and the course that the US takes. Australia's also got a federal government where states have a lot of autonomy. So it's, you know, like as in the US, you can't do everything from above, but they coordinate and try to follow the epidemiological science and the best public health guidelines that we had at the time. They had this experience with SARS, which sensitized them in a way that the US wasn't sensitized. But what's remarkable about Australia over the course of 2020, and that, you know, they wind up having some fairly extreme lockdowns, and there are protests against the government in Australia. It's not like an easy story, but by the end of the year, levels of trust in Australia have actually gone up substantially. And the best data I've seen on this say that if the US had the same mortality level as Australia from COVID, there'd be 900,000 more Americans alive today. So what happens in the United States, I think, is in some ways about these underlying conditions. But here, and I don't like this as an explanation for a lot of things, but here I really do think it's powerful. The fact that we had Trump in the White House at the time that we did, and that Trump, for all the things you could say about him, he's hell-bent on destroying solidarity. Like, if there's anything that he likes to do, it's to turn people against one another and to create a wedge on almost every issue. That and the kind of enormous dysregulation of his mind, I think, like, it led to just bizarre, unstable, kind of chaotic governance that inevitably turned us against each other. In the book I write at length about it, here's a solidarity on the other side. I'm fascinated by the fact that most countries, when they had access to masks, either put them on or didn't put them on. But in the United States is one of the only places you can find where we put them on or didn't put them on, and then fucking killed each other over it. Like, we had these incredibly public cases of people shooting each other and brawling in Walmart and Costco and on airplanes, and the mask became this incredibly powerful symbol on both sides. And if you go back and look at it, when Trump is the person who announces the CDC's policy that Americans should wear masks in public. So he announces the policy, which is only in early April, because there wasn't enough evidence for the WHO to advise for them before, they said. But the moment that Trump announces the policy, he says, like, you know, Americans, from now on, the guideline is that you should wear a mask in public. He says, personally, I'm not going to do it. And that's like the president of the United States trying to advise the population at a time of uncertainty. And not only that, it becomes clear to everybody in the administration that if you do it, he will interpret that as a sign of cowardice, right, of weakness, of femininity. He doesn't want any of that. So that's when Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic, which is where you go if your medical condition is so bad and complicated that nobody can solve it. He goes to the Mayo Clinic, and he's like the only guy in the zip code not to be wearing a mask. And it becomes clear, like, so if you're on the right at this moment, especially if you're in the kind of MAGA right, the way you signal your solidarity with other people is to bare your face. And that baring of the face became the way you could connect with other people who are on Team Red. And then this other thing happens on Team Blue, which is like Andrew goes on his Facebook and he changes his Facebook page to Andrew #wearsamaskRoss, right? And Nikhil on Twitter, like, has a photograph of him with a face mask. And all the Democratic political candidates are doing political ads with masks on. Do you remember this happened? And so then you're walking down the streets of Manhattan, right? Or you're in your grocery store and you see people with masks. You're like, yes, you're on my team. Yes, you're on my team, right? And then you see someone without a mask. Did this happen to you? You see someone without a mask, and it's like your blood starts to boil. You know, you want to kill this person. You can't believe they're doing this thing for you. And it's, I think, one of the things that happened in the United States, and this really is like a political leadership thing, we became incensed with one another even more than we did before. And so the distrust and the division, the polarization, the anger that was obviously there pre-2020, that was defined the Trump presidency in some way, but it got like heated up and hardened. And I don't think that we've recovered in the United States. And I think part of the reason that we're still in this state right now is that you can't just repress that away. We're stuck in that mode. And the distrust, it's more visceral in our body politic than I think we've acknowledged.
Yeah, I mean, just the only time I live in North Carolina, the only time I ever got yelled at for not wearing a mask, or for wearing a mask was in Canada, so. So I think one thing on Trump really quick, this is so purposeful. We quote from an op-ed he wrote for the Los Angeles Times from 1992 where he's bitching about Pat Buchanan, who's running for president. And he's like, all he does is divide people. He pits the Jews against the blacks, against the women, and he does this for political gain. And so it's absolutely the map he's now using. The distrust stuff is really complicated, I think. I just want to throw one wrinkle in there. And the wrinkle is just there's all sorts of stuff to be distrustful about.
Totally, yeah, right.
We're fucking lied to. We're exploited. We're taken advantage of, right? We're gaslit by the Democrats. I was just at the DNC with the first ever member of the Debt Collective, and they're saying, COVID is over, and then it's a super spreader event. Somebody here got COVID there. So we have to figure out how to engage distrust and redirect it, right? There's all sorts of suspicion of big pharma. It's not totally baseless, right? But it became suspicion of the vaccine, of science, instead of thinking about how you could actually create a public health system that protected people, that served people. And I actually think there was a moment where some of us were not engaging with certain critiques because we didn't want to intensify a kind of conspiratorial energy, totally. Right? I mean, there really was a moment when Bill Gates put pressure on a vaccine maker to not put it in the public domain, yeah. Right? That actually happened. And there, so there are, I guess I'm just saying that this trust, we can't just fact check it. We actually have to connect with it emotionally. We have to reorient and reorganize it because it's not, I think with the massive too, it was something existential, right? Like people are facing their vulnerability, they're facing their mortality in this moment, and how do we create some space for folks to have all of those
totally.
Emotions and create and end up with solidarity?
Well, and I think to your point, I mean, it's an important point about trust. Like trust in some ways, like solidarity, there's good and bad varietals,
and trust
right?
has to be earned. You can't just expect people to trust.
Could trust the wrong. There's a lot of people that are incredibly credulous about claims made by podcasters about the Illuminati and 9/11, right? They trust them. They're just like not necessarily trustworthy people, and distrustful of Pfizer, which is probably earned, but also leads you to some bad places. But to me, the sort of politics right now. So here's a thesis, half-baked, but I'd like you to both respond. So you start the book with Kevin Phillips, a fellow Bronx native, who learned his politics in the sort of incredibly intense ethnic and racial trenches of the Bronx. He said the key to politics is to figure out who hates who, and which you guys quote, and he writes one of the sort of original culture war memos for Nixon. He writes this book called The Emerging Republican Majority, which is about using sort of cultural war wedges to build what he calls counter solidarity. So at some level, right-wing movements, both here and abroad, have always been about counter solidarity. But I think you can make an argument the rhetoric of right-wing movements in the US particularly have been individualistic and very much about freedom, and that one of the turns we've seen in our politics is throwing that overboard, that explicitly counter-solidaristic rhetoric has now replaced what used to be kind of more dog-whistly stuff about freedom. It's much more specifically like, you're in this group, and they're in that group, and we hate them, and they're trying to take what's yours, as opposed to, we all want to be free, which often freedom was this sort of, again, code word for all of these counter-solidaristic impulses. But I really do think that there's no more subtlety on this. I mean, right now what you're seeing about Springfield, Ohio is just like pure like textbook stuff. Who hates who? Who can we get on what side? And I'm curious if you think that's the case, that there has been a kind of almost coarsening or stripping away of any kind of pretenses of something other than just like sheer counter solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've described a very strong tendency. And I guess my mind, again, the organizer mind is like, well, where do we intervene in this, right? And point of intervention, I mean, but they're doing that simultaneously. And one way they're doing this is also by speaking of the working class and speaking of a working class in a way that is a reactionary conception of it, right? Sort of reasserting it as white, male, or at least male, American, kind of nativist. So they're doing that because they know that they need to somehow connect with people's real economic experiences and their hardships and the fact that they have thwarted, aspirations. They're not that they feel insecure. So I guess, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a very toxic kind of polarization that's happening, but there are still seeds of real stuff that I think we can work with to build the real version of solidarity. If we do it.
But maybe their version is real. I mean, that's the thing, right?
Like the version is real. It's just reactionary.
Right, totally. Yeah.
Right?
I guess that's sort of the question, right? It's like there's some version of nationalism which is like, you can imagine some very reactionary, xenophobic, but like weirdly maybe kind of pluralistic and multiracial nationalism that some of them seem to be grasping their way to, where like both the black and white residents of Springfield, Ohio show up at the community meeting to scream about the Haitians, a thing that's actually happened. There's always this sort of like, there's the friction in the match of solidarity is the conflict of us versus them, right? Like they are trying to do something very intentionally, which is craft some new category that is a really interesting and menacing thing to me, because it's real. Like there's an actual theory behind this, that this nationalism can actually be a capacious majority coalition. That they can build negative solidarity against specifically immigrants and build a nationalist majority in which solidarity is a solidaritaristic conception of nationalism that does cross lines of difference. I mean, I think they really are like intentional around that.
But this has been the discourse in the left-wing critique of nationalism going back, for example, to World War I, right? Where it's like, right, where, nationalism becomes this cover that papers over class differences and, gives, a poor working person a sense of allegiance and connection to someone who is not just upper class, but exploiting them, right? And, but I guess, I would just say that it's not just raging reactionary nationalists. There's also a whole discourse, and we talk about some of it, that says, welfare states only work if there's some degree of homogeneity, right? That's why the Finnish, and people in Nordic countries get to have a welfare state, is because they're all white and they're the same. And so we take that view to task at length in this book. I mean, but I do think, this. I guess I'm saying that the project might not be as new as we're saying. That
totally.
Pushing a nativist agenda has been a way of breaking down transformative solidarity for a long time.
So I want to make sure we get some conversation going. I do want to give a shout out. I don't know if my colleague Delia Baldassare is here, but there's a group of social scientists at NYU that are really working hard on this question about diversity and pluralism, because there's some terrible social science on the claim that it's homogeneity that allows the welfare state to work. And sadly, like Bob Putnam got behind a lot of that. There's just been some bad science that's circulated because it's an easy message. It's more complicated than that. But I'm glad you brought up the history of nativism here, because that is what we're seeing. I guess the last thing I want to say on this, kind of on the other end of the political spectrum, not from the top down so much as from the bottom up, is one of the surprising things I found across the people I profiled and interviewed for the 2020 book is the extent to which on the left and on the right, people shared this experience of feeling very much on their own. And that, it's true that eventually, we passed the Child Poverty Reduction Act, and eventually we had stimulus payments for people who could qualify, though, like in the United States, it really helped to be lawyered up and to have, high-priced advisors. So like the Cheesecake Factory could get $2 million a day, but if you were like Mr. Cheeseman who ran a cheese shop in the Bronx, you might not get anything. And people really felt that. And so with the exception of the mutual aid, from the black couple in Brooklyn that was left out of their community daycare because he worked as a corrections officer and the community decided that he was a disease vector and so they didn't want the family involved, to the guy who got radicalized on the far right, who was a bar manager in Staten Island, who got radicalized because he felt like, why is everyone so intent on keeping me out of business but not doing anything so that I can be afloat? There was this kind of undercurrent of people feeling like at a moment of crisis, when we needed to give each other a hand, when we needed that kind of solidarity and a plug into the state, we had to solve on our own. We had to solve it on our own. And I guess the question for me is whether there's a politics that can be remade from that, whether there's some group like the debtors that didn't see themselves as a group that can identify with this experience of feeling like too much of their fate rests in what they can do on their own, and that want some kind of collective solution. And I see in the frustration of very different kinds of voters this clamoring for something different. And I don't think either party has stepped up to answer that. So for me, the kind of hope in some other possibility of an American politics that regains that is that we start to see it. And I felt like the intellectual excitement of this book, your book, is that you can see those ideas start to come up.
I think that one of the challenges that about this is that when you guys talk about sort of solidarity state, and that the way that solidarity gets institutionalized is ultimately tends towards bureaucracy, right? So it's like, well, what's a solidarity state? Well, the solidarity state's the National Health Service. Like, we all are in this together. We have literally one health service. It's called the National Health Service. Okay, well, now we have there's an actual thing that's actually a bureaucracy, and people love the National Health Service in the UK, but of course they have a million fights about it. So that feeling that the woman reported of being at that event in Washington, which is such an incredible text and amazing, ultimately, if you're successful, is replaced with bureaucracy.
No.
Yeah, I mean...
Well,
right?
Think,
Isn't it or what is the thing that animates it so it doesn't just feel that way?
Yes. I think actually I'm kind of pure. Sometimes you need bureaucracy. It's not always bad. Sometimes you need some.
Try taking Social Security away.
No, exactly.
Right. People will be attached to very bureaucratic systems. I think part of it is, and this is an insight from sociology, is I think the first step to a solidarity state is making, if you're poor in the society, the state, what meager services you get are really visible, they're really demeaning, yes. They will probably fail you, you will have to jump through a zillion hoops, you'll be stigmatized and shamed. Once you get to middle class, upper middle class, rich, actually, there's all this good stuff that happens to you without a lot of bureaucracy, right?
My little invisible mortgage interest deduction.
All of these, so we...
No caseworker asking me about that.
But the problem with that is that it creates the delusional sense that you're independent. So I think, we've just proven you don't need bureaucracy, but that its absence is socially destructive and undermines solidarity.
And the point about Social Security, I think, is an important one. And I think actually a thing that, again, goes around with the National Health Service and fights about things that people do that are examples of solidarity state that people love is that there is something over and above the material thing it does, I guess is what I'm getting at. There is a story about the fact that it represents something that we owe to each other or we do for each other. The idea of Social Security, which is amazing, which that every politician will say, you paid into it. There's this idea of the story about it has a certain binding glue to it that is very different than the binding glue of redistribution or charity or things like that.
Well, a lot of people are looking at Project 2025, right? So we're going to get to questions, but don't read the whole thing. But the sentiment is basically we're going to take the state to remake the character of people, to remake the American populace as creatures of God, to change minds through changing policy. Margaret Thatcher famously said that, right? The point isn't economics. That's just the method. The goal is to change the soul. And so right-wingers are engaged in a kind of reactionary statecraft, and they're using policy to do that. And I think that a solidarity state would aim at economic redistribution while also consciously cultivating, a different character, a sense. This is why we don't want the state to be submerged. We want folks to see it. We don't want the bureaucracy to be demeaning, but we want it to reveal the fact that we are part of the same society.
And collective obligation and duty, which is a huge part of the rhetoric around the Scandinavian social democracies, interestingly enough.
Mike, let's take a couple questions together.
So should I stand up? So I have a question, actually relates to this last point about how we should conceptualize the basis of solidarity, because obviously it spans a spectrum. You know, you can have a very basic alignment of self-interest as a basis for solidarity. You can get to what Eric talked about, which is a bit deeper, this recognition of our fundamental interdependence physically and socially. The pandemic showed this to us, climate change shows this. But it remains true, at least in our current societies, that there's a lot of inequality in the extent to which people are vulnerable to that interdependence. So if you have resources, you survive the pandemic in a different way, you survive climate change in a different way. And that leads me to wonder, and maybe this relates to the article that Chris wrote long ago, which I admit I just Googled on my phone because it sounded really interesting. But is the conception of solidarity we need and that we're aspiring to, does it actually rely on the recognition of something deeper, of our moral or spiritual interdependence, where actually, you know, the suffering of another human being feels like it harms me, regardless of my immediate self-interest and regardless of maybe the medium-term interdependence between us. So that's kind of what I'm wondering if you could speak to. And I think relatedly, and this goes to Astra's point, I also wonder if we draw that circle of solidarity any narrower than the whole human community, we do run the risk of insularity and this type of reactionary solidarity. So where does that deeper stuff kind of play in?
Let's do one or two more questions, Mike.
Hi, thank you so much. Astra, if I may ask you, just using the debt collective as like an example to sort of think about the tactics in terms of achieving not just the ends of solidarity and bringing people together, but also then obviously the technical ends that you want. You want the Department of Education to, reduce debt. And just curious from your example from last weekend and visibly bringing people together, which sounded amazing. Hopefully that helps achieve the solidarity piece and helping build connections and relationships. But do you find that that's useful with, I'm sure, a myriad of other tactics and actually getting, the Department of Education to make a move, or what are you finding most useful?
I have a quick case study that sort of confounded me. So I'm a member of a number of cancer support groups, which is a place that people go to find solidarity. And in these groups, there's all of a sudden sort of an anti-science sentiment. And I know it stems from sort of anti-vax. And so, it's a place where people should go and share information. But it's been split. So this idea of going to find solidarity with other cancer patients is gone because this overarching, as you mentioned, the push against wearing masks, the push, the anti-vaxxer stance. And so I'm sort of confounded. I don't know what to do in these groups. How do you bring people together when they're split? And it's just the idea that it's in a medical group, essentially. People are going through medical treatment, and this is where we are. So this idea of solidarity, you're going there to share your experiences. And we're split. It's a microcosm. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it's uncommon to have the experience of trying to, and we talked about this kind of distinction between solidarity in theory and solidarity in practice, where you unite together around some shared cause, and very quickly it emerges that there are fault lines, and then the kind of question immediately becomes, like, Are there fault lines that you can't get over, and that break up your capacity to to support one another and to operate as a we, or can you find the points of commonality and common vision and build around those? So I imagine I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this, 'cause from a tactical perspective.
If you connects the deck collective,
yeah,
I'm sure there's.
I mean, I guess in that moment, it's like, well, is that your mission, right? To convert the folks who are in your group. And if you want to, but if you, or, is addressing that kind of mistrust in science and that ethos actually tactically better done at some other level, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think there's sometimes when you go, my energy isn't well spent building solidarity with this small group of folks. But I mean, what you're saying, it is a microcosm of the society we're living in. For these two questions, I'm sorry, Anne, I don't have a good advice for you. That's really tricky. These two questions, I actually want to think them together, because I think you're right. Like, we do need to ultimately think at the scale of the world, not just our fellow humans, but of solidarity with other species, which I've written a lot about with my sister Sonora. Thinking, because this whole ecological, the point is that we're not just interdependent with each other socially, but with the systems that that provide water, air, food, nurturants, and the creatures that share this planet with us. So yes, solidarity with the whole world. But then I love this question, but then what are the tactics? How do we get to that point? And I think part of the enjoyment of the challenge of solidarity is actually we do get to inhabit both those registers. So on the spiritual point, we actually, in the book, with a return to the sacred, so that is also where Durkheim did a lot of writing on this. I'm not telling y'all anything you don't know, but really saying that, and some of it is about creating new values together, and ultimately, this idea that no person is disposable. And that we are going to try to treat, and this creates a sort of ethos of how we treat other people, how we engage with them, the kind of curiosity and compassion and humility we bring to our organizing efforts. So yes, I think you're right that that's aspirational, but it's very hard to operate at the scale of the world. Tactically, sometimes we have to choose our battles. I mean, the Debt Collective would like to build economic power and be able to shut shit down, right? Like to say, we're not paying this payday lender that has been destroying people's lives, and we're gonna go on a debt strike and stop that. We are, taking on this predatory hospital that's been taken over by private equity, and we're gonna exert some economic might. That is actually a difficult thing to do in the realm of student debt, because 90% of student debt is actually backed by the federal government, so we don't have the kind of economic leverage. Our movement also isn't that big, so even if we had we don't have the numbers, nor is student debt, federal student debt structured that way. So yes, we've been using every lever we can. So much more acting like policy wonks than I ever thought. We've basically uncovered almost every legal tool the federal government has. Sort of finding obscure provisions and reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act, then going lobbying. We have engaged in militant debt strikes periodically that are, but that wield more sort of symbolic power than economic might, and also engaging in the war of ideas. Pushing against the idea that debtors need forgiveness, which sort of implies that debtors have done something wrong, and instead demanding cancellation, abolition of debts, relief. And legitimizing the idea that was inconceivable 10 years ago that student debt should be canceled for people.
I just in response to that, the first question and the third one, my own totally basic B liberal response to this is that beliefs matter a lot and ideology matters a lot, and what cultivating through practice, through shared struggle, a belief in people's fundamental equality and solidarity with people is really important. And to the last question, people, I just feel that the challenge in all this is that conflict is endemic to human affairs, and people are going to disagree about stuff and have different views. And if you ever want a window into that, look at the writings of the International Working Men's Association, in the 19th century, which was all about how like everybody has the same interests if they have the same material interests, and like all they did was fight with each other over every single factional tendency. So that like there's like solidarity is a way of overcoming that, but never dissolving it, because it's not soluble in human life, is my own feeling.
I think it's a great insight, and I think also it's worth pausing on your question, Shahzad, about values and the limits of this community or the capaciousness of it. For us to kind of go back to Chris's question about what made the United States dissolve in the way that we did, there is something about the brutality of the country at this moment, the kind of desecration of this idea of the sanctity of life that we see play out on a daily basis in ways that are really disturbing. I mean, like we are at a disturbing moment, and it's hard to not connect the kind of absence of that rhetoric around solidarity in the United States with our kind of refusal to take each other seriously and to respect the dignity of each other's lives, and the kind of level of brutality that we've become accustomed to, I think is historically shocking. And again, this is one of these things that haunts the conversation about this year's election. So I think there's a conversation around solidarity to be pushed just within the country that we desperately need, but also we see the limits of that, because without this more global conception of solidarity, we wind up even if we're successful here, we wind up with the story of the vaccine distribution that we got, which is like we created, like if there's anything that the United States could be said to have done relatively well in that year, it was to find a way to harness the power of medical innovation and technology to get these vaccines out, and just utter moral failure on our will to share with the world. And so I think, like, for me, what your question, Shahzad, really points to is the kind of the limits of just thinking about how to fix ourselves at this moment. There's so much more work to do. Unfortunately, it's past 7, and we've run out of time. I know that Astra and I are going to head over to the books at the end, and happy to have conversations in the back of the room. I want to give a huge thank you to Chris, who has almost no nights off from his schedule on MSNBC, and who really generously came to be with us tonight. So, Chris, thank you. Astra, thank you. Thank you for this terrific book, and for really sparking lots of conversation here at IPK among students, faculty, staff, everyone. It really got us all thinking. Thanks to Mike and Milan and the IPK staff, and I hope to see you all very soon.